All right, we're back in section 1.5, and now for you that are in your notes, I'm in the bottom of the first page of 1.5, and we're going to talk about finding information from a diagram and what it means. And a lot of you look at a picture and you're like, well, I think that's 90 degrees. Or a lot of you look at a picture and, well, I think those things are the same. Well, there are things that you can assume and things that you cannot assume. So this is a really, really important part of what we're going to look at here. So it says here there are some relationships that you can assume to be true from a diagram that has no marks or measures. Okay, there are things that you can assume to be true. There are other relationships you cannot assume directly. Okay, so for example, you can conclude the following from an unmarked diagram. So if a diagram is not marked, these are things that you can say by looking at it that you know are true. One, angles are adjacent. You can conclude that without having a marking. You can conclude that angles are adjacent and supplementary without having any markings. Again, if they're adjacent, they're supplementary, they're going to form a straight line. You can also assume that angles are vertical angles. Again, you don't have to have a picture to be marked to know that they're vertical. Now, things you cannot conclude. Okay, so these are things that have to absolutely be marked. If they're not marked, you cannot assume that these are true. So, angles or segments that are congruent. If they're not marked, then you cannot assume that they're congruent to each other. They have to be marked first. Okay? You cannot assume that an angle is a right angle. Even though you might think it looks perfectly like a right angle, you cannot assume that it's a right angle. It has to have that little box in the corner. Okay, those are things that you cannot assume. Also, you cannot assume that angles are complementary. You cannot assume that two angles will add up to be 90 degrees just by looking at a picture. Okay, again, you cannot conclude that it's a right angle, let alone the two angles are complementary. So those are three things that you cannot just assume are true. They have to be marked. Okay? All right, now with that being said, let's take a look at some things that, as some examples as well, using those things. But before I do that, the first thing I want to talk about, there's one angle pair we didn't talk about, and that was a linear pair. We talked about this in your vocabulary. Again, if you remember, a linear pair is a pair of adjacent angles whose non-common sides are opposite rays. The angles of a linear pair form a straight angle. Okay, so in other words, when you have a linear pair, you have a pair of angles that add up to be 180 degrees. Okay, so it says here, the postulate 1.9, if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. They add up to be 180 degrees. Okay, now in terms of things that you can you assume that two angles are a linear pair? Yes, you can. That does not have to be marked in the diagram. Okay, so let's take a look at this first picture. The question says, what are some things that you can conclude from the information in the diagram? Okay, so as you look at the diagram, remember what I said about studying pictures, okay? Being able to study pictures is an important part of being successful in geometry because you have to be able to look at a picture and tell me some things that you can know. For example, let's take the easy parts here first. You notice that these two angles have the same marking. Well, if they have the same marking, I know for sure, because they have the same marking, I know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Now, if this didn't have a marking, could I say that? No, I couldn't. I cannot assume that those are true. In order for them to be congruent, they have to have the marking. Okay? Another thing that I can show on here is that if you look here at angle 3 and angle 4, if you look at those two angles, angle 3 and angle 4, they form a straight line. So I can assume that angle 3 plus angle 4 is equal to 180 degrees. Or they are a linear pair. Okay, they are a linear pair. I could also do the same thing with angles 4 and 5. I can assume that those are a linear pair. Okay. All right, one other thing that I want to look at here that I can assume, and that is if you look at angle 3 and angle 5. Those form a perfect X, or they're opposite rays on both sides. Again, I can assume that angle 3 and angle 5 are vertical angles. That's something that I can conclude. Now, can I say that angle 4 and angle 3 are congruent to each other? No, I can't, because they don't have any markings. Okay, so those are things that I can assume that can be true. Okay, let's look at the bottom example here now. It says here, can you make each conclusion from the information in the diagram? So this is essentially yes or no. And let's take a look here. It says, can you conclude that segment TW is congruent to WV? So do I know that TW is congruent to WV in the picture? Well, I can answer yes to that. Why can I answer yes to that? Because those two segments are marked. They have the same marking, so I know those two guys are congruent to each other. Okay. What about PW and WQ? Well, if you look at the picture, PW and WQ, man, they look pretty darn close to being the same, but do they have a marking on them? They do not have a marking. So no, I cannot conclude that those are congruent. In this case, how would I explain that? What I put is NEI. That stands for not enough information. Okay? There's not enough information there to conclude that I can say that those are congruent. All right. Angle TWQ. TWQ. Well, it says here TWQ is a right angle. Can I conclude that? Wait a second. I got a question for you. How do I know whether that's 89.4 or 90 degrees? Well, I don't know that. So no, I cannot conclude that that's a right angle because it's not marked with a little box. Again, not enough information. Okay. All right, the next one. The next one's kind of a tough one because it says TV, segment TV, this segment right here, bisects PQ. Or when it says it bisects it, remember it cuts it into two equal parts. So this segment cuts this segment in half into two equal parts. Wait, does it do that? Are these two segments congruent, PW and WQ? No, they're not. Those are not marked congruent. So can I conclude that TV bisects PQ? Nope, I cannot. There is not enough information there. Okay. Now, if let's say that these guys had two markings on them, like this, okay? Those two lines had two markings on them. Could I do that then? I could do letter D if that was the case. But in this case, that's not the case. So I cannot conclude that. Okay, so you should be able to you should be able to finish the examples below here in your 1-5 class kick.